Right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. We're going to get started in a second, but it's good to see everybody here. We got folks flying in from across the world. I like to see these numbers rise 29, 30, 40, 50. Hopefully, we'll get up to hopefully it'll be the maximum attendance, like 500 people sign up, 500 people show up. I think the way to do it is next time I'll make a video ad that says, "You signed up for the webinar, huh? You better show up." And I'll spend $3,000 so it shows up on Facebook and you can't turn it off.
You know who's always here?
What's that?
I always scroll through the names to see if I recognize anybody. Kate Radloff is always here. Kate, you're awesome. I see your name on all the webinars. And Thomas Studer as well. He's here a lot.
Yeah, it's always great seeing names coming in
we
again and
appreciate
again.
You guys.
Oh, absolutely. And shout out to, I think it was Matthew. He donated to the Pleistocene Park in their last few days, so he gave $350, which was awesome. Cool.
Free Wild Siberia.
I know, right? Like I look at those guys. I'm like, hopefully in a few years, we've sending airships over there from the excess from Yellowstone to the native tribes to Canada to Alaska and then to Siberia.
Glimpsing the bison over the
yeah.
What's the name of that? Over the Bering Strait.
The Bering Strait. Yeah, I know, right?
The bison blimp.
The bison blimp. There we go. I bet if we crowdfunded it, it could happen. It could happen.
We'd have to have like a giant blimp, a giant bison face on the side of the blimp.
Yeah, that'd be dope. Okay, everybody. Well, it's 11 o'clock. Why don't we just get started? Again, welcome back, everybody. Neil, why don't you give the SDMC an intro, and then I will intro Zach, and we'll get started.
Here we go. For all of you that this is your, did we hit record, by the way? Are we recording?
Yeah, it's recording right now.
Okay. Welcome, everyone, to Sustainable Design Masterclass. I'm Neil Spagman. My co-founder, Raleigh Latham, is here with us, and we got Zach Weiss today on for webinar number 2. Zach was one of our first ones when we got started almost 3 years ago.
Yeah.
If this is your first webinar with us, let us know underneath. We've done more than 50 of these webinars focused on the intersection of ecology, agriculture, and entrepreneurship. And we bring on some of the world's top designers and practitioners. We've got stuff that you can see on sustainabledesignmasterclass.com and Raleigh's Vimeo channel, where we keep a lot of these old things that you can access. So if you're interested, check those out. Thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks especially to Zach, who's going to talk to us about rehydrating Earth. All right, Raleigh, you take it away.
All right, thanks everybody for showing up, taking time out of your busy week in the middle of summer and in the beginning of summer to show up to this. This is so awesome because Zach is coming on again after 2 years. 2 years of working super hard. He's out there every week, like jumping from a different country, a different place, like building ponds, building terraces, building chinampas. It's really incredible. I had the opportunity to work with Zach a few years ago. We were introduced through a Sepp Holzer workshop, and if you don't know about Sepp Holzer yet, when you start watching this stuff, it's gonna blow your mind, and it will literally, because this is a man who has probably the most connection to nature and a way of explaining it that is so obvious and it's so powerful, and it shows a way that we could reconnect and learn how to work with these systems. And Zach, working with him, you realize that he, through the sheer amount of projects he's been on, he's really learned how to work with water, how to rehydrate landscapes, how to bring water back to areas that might be deserts, might be in drought, and by building these water retention landscapes, kickstart this ecosystem restoration process. And this is through all the time he spent working with Sepp Holzer in front of his years of breaking his teeth, working 12, 13 hours, 16 hours a day on these projects. Again, it's an honor to bring Zach back on because he's connected with nature, and he'll really take you on a journey in explaining these concepts of rehydrating the landscape. And again, this is part 6 of our water restoration series. So I hope you all enjoyed. And yeah, turn off your Facebook, turn off your distractions. And Zach, why don't you take it away, man?
Awesome. Well, thanks for the amazing introduction, Raleigh. It's a real honor to be here, and it's cool to be back after, yeah, being one of your guys' first webinars here. So, Raleigh, you see my screen there? We're good to go?
Yeah, just a quick check. Let us know, everybody. Can you see and hear Zach all right? Give me some ones if everything's fine, because we got a presentation. We got some video that we tested out. All right, we got 111. All right, we are good to go, man. So take it away.
Excellent. So yeah, you guys have been having really incredible talks around water. I've been watching a lot of the other webinars, and I've really come to, it was one of the first things Sep said to me, but I really come to understand it deeper and deeper every day working in the earth, working with the water, that water is Earth's blood, and it's really moving through. It's in so many ways directly tied to Earth's immune system, to Earth's climate cycles, determines the heat dynamics, it determines the moisture dynamics, the living dynamics of the planet we live on. And you see these veins all over the Earth. And when you start to think of this analogy, you can start to understand a little bit more what we're doing to the Earth, what kind of results that might have. If you think of in the body, when blood is draining out of a part of the body or being stopped up, it causes problems not just in that immediate body part, but in the system as a whole. And over the last 10,000 years, humans have desertified 1/3 of Earth's land. So this is the Fertile Crescent, the Levant, the birthplace of agriculture 10,000 years ago. And you wouldn't, from an aerial image from currently, you wouldn't think that a lot of agriculture could even happen then. But this used to be such a fertile place. This is where man first started settling and cultivating the same piece of land. The Sahara, which another one, I'm not going to go too deep into all of this stuff because you guys have had a lot of great presenters talking about how then agriculture moved to the Sahara with domestic animals, and with tillage agriculture desertified a former savanna. The Tibetan Plateau, which I find really interesting because it was contiguously inhabited for 20,000 years, but it wasn't until the last 6 to 10,000 years that it really started shifting climate-wise, and that was with people bringing place-based agriculture to this region. And so these are the areas that are driest, that are most susceptible to this, but we're also creating areas like this. This is a mine in Cyprus, and the color in that water is not from anything good. I know other mines with where the water is the pH of stomach acid, and that water is actually rising up. And so we've created a lot of these really disastrous places, but we've also really created an impact. I want to bring this to every viewer here, what kind of environmental footprint they have, because it's easy to see a mine or a clear-cut forest and say, okay, that's really bad. But it's harder to see how the cities and the suburbs and the places that we live are also causing hydrological disturbance. This is a valley in Colombia, in Bogota, and when it rains, the streets still flood with water. It's a couple of feet deep, a half-meter deep. And even so, all of the infrastructure here is designed to carry the water away as quickly as possible. And when you look at where this city is situated, it's in a valley. So it's not just drying out this valley itself, but it's actually taking all the water that would have collected into the wetlands and the filter areas in that valley and sending that downstream as quickly as possible. And this tree I have here, this is from before Columbus arrived on this continent in North America. And this is a tree that saw a huge change. When this tree was first growing, you could drink out of any water in any body of water, a lake, a river, a spring, a creek in North America. And in a very short amount of time, we've changed it so that there's a lot of water that would make you sick if you drank from it. There's all sorts of toxins and different issues. And it's one thing for us, but it's another thing for all the other life on this planet, which can't get away from our toxic water. And so if you go back all the way to Plato, he's speaking about the land being like the withered bones of a wasted body, all the rich parts having fallen away, just the skeleton being left. and how in a previous time the annual rainfall was really stored and given out to the landscape, and now in short order it's only affording sustenance to bees. And this is over 2,000 years ago that he's talking about this. We can only imagine the changes that have happened from that time to now. And one of the pieces I want to really pull out here is he says at the end of this, and in the heaven above, an excellently tempered climate. And he was talking about the previous times with an abundance of water, when the water infiltrated into the landscape. And so even our early philosophers over 2,000 years ago were starting to recognize the connection between water and how hydrated land is, and then the impact that that has on the resulting climate that we experience in our environment. So this is an illustration I've been sharing that I would call Victor Schauberger's half water cycle illustrated. And you can see that with all these hard surfaces, the water is just draining away. What's happening is actually flooding the lowland areas while not infiltrating into the ground in the highland areas. So you're getting shallow, wide bodies of water that are leading to faster evaporation. You're also getting a lot of high pressure air rising off of all these exposed surfaces, the concrete, the rooftops, all of the non-living surfaces. That's pushing the low pressure humid air into certain places. So you're getting more intense storms where they happen, and you're getting drought in other places. And then you're getting this cycle of one drought leads to the flood, which then leads to the next drought, because this water isn't stored and balanced out. With the warm soil, the water can't infiltrate. And so it really just runs downstream. You eventually get into problems with fire, desertification. And this is how we've taken some of these really fertile landscapes that I was showing aerial photos of before and turned them into a dust bowl, a desert. This is a feedback loop. So the drier places get, the less precipitation they receive, and therefore the drier they get. And so it starts to spin out of control when you get too far down along this path. And so this is leading to a lot of human suffering, catastrophic situations. This is a wildfire in Chile. Thousands and thousands of hectares were burning all over Chile. This is drought. This is flood. You have all these really horrific consequences, which when they happen are called natural disasters. But there's nothing natural about these disasters. These disasters are the direct result of short-sighted management. Management where people aren't thinking about the long-term impacts of their actions. They're thinking only about the immediate returns. And if we start to think with the long-term impacts, we'd start to manage land a lot differently. And so the beautiful thing is we live in really interesting times. We live in times where we can create change. And right now we're having this fiery influence on the world. We're desertifying huge tracts of land. We're modifying the climate so that it's really severe and extreme. But we have the ability to work with all the positive forces and to create something really special. I'm just going to get a video going here in the background. So we really...
Everybody can just let us know if you see the video here.
Looking good?
Let me see. Yep, everybody can see it.
Excellent.
Go ahead.
So these are some of the veins of Earth, and if you think, it really is like the body, and so the impact that you have has a rippling impact throughout the system. And so these veins are where we can really work, where we can create an impact that's going to be felt throughout the system. The mountains are a really important part of this water cycle. With orographic lift, they're forcing more moisture out of the air. They're collecting and concentrating that moisture in certain areas. They're preserving it throughout, not only from the wet season to the dry season, from the cold times to the warms, but throughout years in the form of glaciers and snowpacks, and they're really the crowns of the water cycle. As you come down off of the mountains, you enter the forests, a really key part. The trees are condensing moisture, they're respiring moisture, they're changing the temperature, they're balancing out the climate, they're shading the soil, they're producing hygroscopic bacteria that are seeding the clouds, they're feeding the fungi that are creating more water, that are demineralizing the rock. They're a really key and vital, they're the mother organisms of the water cycle. Then you get to the flowing parts of water, the creeks, the rivers, the waterfalls. In these areas, water is a strong dipole, and so it takes on different forms based on how it's interacting with the landscape. And so in these areas, the water is moving through, it's being mineralized, it's being charged, it's vortexing, it's taking on this most healthy structure while being filtered. And then you have the rivers, which really give life in so many different ways. They give life in the form of fish, but they're also this annual gift of fertility on all the landscapes where they flood, on all the banks. And they're the main arteries, the main veins of the system, and a really important resource to capitalize on and to use cautiously, and something people are always drawn to is the rivers. And then moving out and back into the ocean through the mangroves, through the estuaries. And so this is really a living, it's almost like the planet is respiring water as water is moving through the system. And we've had a really big impact over the years as far as how water moves through this system and how long it stays in the various pieces. And so this is what I would call the full water cycle, where this is what was naturally in place, where the cool soil is able to really absorb the falling rain. And so that's feeding in and charging up the water table, charging up the hydrology, feeding springs, which are then feeding creeks and rivers and lakes. And so with this, even though the moisture isn't always present in the form of rain, this is the shock absorber, extending that moisture throughout the system. The trees are then producing the bacteria for the clouds to coalesce. And then as the clouds move from a very voluminous vapor to condense, there's a phase change there, pulling in more moisture. And so this again is a feedback loop. The more we shade the soil, the more water we infiltrate into the ground, the more precipitation that happens. The longer that moisture stays in the ground, the more life happens, and then the more precipitation happens. And so this is a feedback loop that can keep feeding itself as much or as little as we want it to. And so I really came to realize this over the journey of my life, but I've always been really action oriented. And so it's one thing to understand the problems and the issues, but it's another thing to be able to create and implement the solutions. And so what I've really dedicated myself to for my life, but especially for the last 6 years since I started working with SEP, is having boots on the ground and actually implementing the different pieces to work with these positive feedback loops. And so I was fortunate enough to come across Sepp Holzer, who's just an incredible person, a visionary when it comes to water potential, visionary when it comes to recognizing the potential in nature and the synergy there and the beauty that can exist cooperating with nature. And so I was able to, the first time was at a workshop in 2012 in Montana, and we really got to work with him on the land. He's a visionary, but he doesn't work in classrooms. He doesn't work on whiteboards. He works in the ground, in the seed, in the soil, creating symphonies of ecological systems. And so over the course of 11 days, we transitioned this property, which you see towards the bottom of the picture. You can see the red roofed house and then a little wetlands pond there with another little wetlands below. This is an area where the previous owner thought it would be a good idea to build an airstrip in the middle of it. So they built a long airstrip. You can see that long cleared area. And in 11 days, we were able to restore it to a state that's potentially even more functional than what was in place previously in this wetland. It's hard to even understand what exactly the landscape used to be like in the past, because as I was talking, this degradation goes back a lineage farther than we can really comprehend, but we do have the ability to work with the positive feedback loops to make something that's really healthy, that's really vital, and that not only creates an impact on that property itself, but that impact ripple effects up and downstream from the property. This is a kilometer of hugelkultur that was made there with a close-up of some of the other ponds. And Sepp's farm is just a shining example. The Kramatterhof in Austria, it's in what's called the Siberia of Austria. And in this landscape, he made a network of 72 interconnected ponds and lakes. It's a beautiful place. It's a healing place. It has just beautiful, crystal clear water. It's a productive farm. It's a learning center. It's so many things. And it's on land that was thought to be wasteland, that was the scrubs, or maybe you could grow a little bit of grains, maybe you could do some animals, but it wasn't really useful for anything but that. And so I could go on for hours just about what they're doing up there, but I want to share just a few of the really important things. So they've cultivated niche crops that are really successful. This is a European crawfish that is hard to grow over there, but because they have this natural system, it just thrives within their aquaculture setup. And they make as much money each given year off of this little crustacean as they do off of all of their other animal operations put together, of which they have a lot of chickens, pigs, cows, sheep, a couple of horses. But these crawfish have been one of the really, really good economically viable crops that they've been able to produce because they're in such a natural system. Another thing here, there's mushroom logs cultivated under cherry trees, and I use the analogy, they're growing so many things on any given year, more than they'll harvest. And what this opens up is the possibility for every year the climate to really be a benefit because something has a bumper crop. For example, in this picture, if it's a really dry year, the mushrooms aren't producing much, and so they don't harvest the mushrooms, but the cherries are a particularly high value for schnapps. In a really wet year, the cherries are all splitting and molding, but the mushrooms are really having a bumper year. And so this enables you to, instead of always be complaining about the climate, it's too hot, it's too cold, it's too wet, it's too dry, by working with diverse ecological systems, you can really just be grateful for the climate each year as it comes. And this is some of the lakes up higher. It's just an incredibly beautiful place. I really recommend visiting. So Sepp created this wonderful farm at the Kramatterhof, but then he started working around the world in some of the more degraded places. This is Tamera in Portugal, a community that didn't know if they were going to be able to stay up there because they weren't producing enough water. They're on a deep borehole well that barely produced enough water for the community, and they didn't have enough water for gardens and things like that. After Sepp came and put in some water retention landscaping, they now have more water than they need for their agricultural uses. They're now using the water for the community from shallow wells that are recharged with their own water retention. Their neighbors have springs down below. And this is really a wholesale landscape shift. If you're driving through there, you're driving through really desertified places, and then you get to this beautiful lush oasis within it, where they were just, there's no unnatural materials in here. This is using the rainwater, nothing else to fill it, and it's working with the forces of nature to their best possible end result. And so it's a shining example of what's possible from a potential of water retention landscapes. But this is actually a project that upon visiting, to me, is even more impressive. This is in the Extremadura in Spain, a place that's 45 degrees Celsius and blowing hot 50-kilometer-an-hour winds for about 3 months in the summer. And this is where all the cork oaks were dying. And here he was able to create a network of 16 interconnected ponds. They were doing all sorts of things to see what problems with the cork oaks. They were injecting different things for viruses, very expensive solutions that they were trying to do to fix these drying trees. But when Sepp went there, he said the virus isn't in the trees, the virus is in your heads, because he saw that these trees were very clearly stressed from a lack of water. And stress is the root of all disease. And so yes, they did have disease issues, but it was from a fundamental water stress. So again, using the natural materials, he was able to create this water retention landscape. This is just a beautiful place with all sorts of wildlife now. And when you look, these next two pictures I want to show you to illustrate how with this type of water retention landscape, you're not just storing the water in the water feature, the pond or lake itself, but you're storing the water in all the areas around and above them, because the pond is closed, watertight on the dam side, but then open on the other. So you're really returning this water to the landscape. It's not like a liner pond that holds the water separate from the landscape. It holds the water, but it doesn't give it back. This is a type of water retention landscaping to really return that water. And so this is when we talk about rehydrating the earth. This is where we're recharging aquifers. We're giving subsurface irrigation to different crops. We're charging springs and creeks and rivers, and we're really feeding this blood that we've stolen from the earth back into it. This is a stork living with swallows making their nest directly below, and it's just beautiful. In all of these projects that I've showed, you can go there at any time and find tracks from all the different wildlife that's around, because they become not just really productive, beautiful places for the human inhabitants, but for the wildlife, the domestic animals, and all the other life, the plants, the insects, the birds, all the life that's going to come through the landscape. And so I just want to speak really quickly about how important I think mentorship is. I had the really amazing blessing and privilege to be able to be shown the way by a visionary who's, in my opinion, the world's leading expert on how to restore the hydrology of the planet. But these experts are out there all over the place, and all over the place there's elders and mentors that want to be passing on their knowledge, but they need a vested student to be able to do that. So making yourself available and working hard to make an impact, to make an impression, that's really important. And to have someone like this guiding me into the woods, guiding me into the hydrology, guiding me into the natural systems and the natural way of cultivating, I'm so much farther than I could have ever gotten on my own. And so I'm hugely grateful to that. And to be able to work on the ground doing these projects, I wouldn't feel comfortable doing so many of the things that I am now if it wasn't for this time over the last 6 years working with SEP, being on the ground for different projects in different scenarios. And so I noticed with all this movement, there's a lot of people that really want to get involved. They want to start doing something. They've heard the problems, they understand the issues. The biggest thing you can do is just going and starting to put your hands in the ground, starting to do experiments, seeing the actions, and then if you can seek out mentors and people that have a particularly high point of knowledge in the areas that you want to work in, you're going to just increase your rate of learning so much exponentially. So now I'm going to go through and show some different projects from the last 6 years, really taking these things that I learned working with SEP and applying them to projects of my own. So here is a project in Montana. I started a lot of projects in Montana. That's the before, and this is the after. Creating a crater garden, an enhanced microclimate where we're catching all the water off of the roof in the driveway that you see above, storing that in a water retention feature in the middle of a crater garden, and then having a berm all around it so that you have a nice sheltered area where, in this case, very desiccating wind isn't able to blow through. You also have a nice warmer microclimate. And it was incredible working on this project to go there in the middle of a hot summer day. It's hot and dry in Montana, and you could walk into here and literally smell and feel the humidity. And because of that, everything grows very well in a garden like this because that water element is there. You're protecting it, you're holding it, and you're preserving it. Here's another berm and pond in an even windier spot. And so this is actually the start of berming the entire property. This is a place so windy it'll blow a tree right over, blow the hat right off of your head. But we were able to store the water and provide shelter, provide wind suppression, and then this all is now planted with an extra layer of biological protection from the wind. And so really we're creating enhanced microclimates where you have more moisture, more humidity, more growth, and so everything's happening at a little bit faster rate in these ecosystems. It's a different garden in Montana that I have as a picture to show you a little bit what they look like, because they don't look like your standard manicured garden. They don't look like your market garden, for example, because nature doesn't look like those things. Nature is this diverse network and web, and so you have different plants growing to different root zones, using different nutrients in the soil, and it's something that looks more haphazard. It's not in straight rows, but it can look really beautiful. And the more important thing is it works really well. And so this is a project, these next couple of pictures, where it was people's first gardens. They didn't know what to do. They started with this natural progression, and because they were okay with the way it looked, they're harvesting more food than they can deal with out of the garden, even though they're doing very little work, because they're taking a different approach with it. They're really using nature's forces to their benefit. This is an earth cellar for the same client. This is an area where using the earth down below frost line maintains a consistent temperature of the mean annual temperature of a place. And so in a lot of climates, you can use this for storing root crops. You can use this to help balance and buffer the climate. And building into that earth temperature is another way to utilize the resources that are available to us freely. This is a different style. This is for an animal shelter. There's a lot of different ways to do these, but the same concept, where in the summer when it's really hot outside, it's nice and cool inside these shelters. In the winter when it's really cold, it's warmer inside these shelters, because you're getting more of that earth temperature and the shelter from the surrounding harsh conditions. This is a greenhouse using that same earth coupling effect. And so it's dug down into the ground, insulated on the stem walls. This is essentially a passive solar, passive geothermal greenhouse. And so this greenhouse doesn't freeze throughout the winter, even in Montana where it gets -20 for a week on end, or a couple of weeks sometimes. But this greenhouse is using the warm air that's generated throughout the day on sunny days, blowing that through the floor of the greenhouse to charge up that temperature, but then it's also tied into that consistent ground temperature. And so it has a couple of different things working for it. It also has earth tubes taking the outside air, running that through the ground before it enters into the greenhouse, which functions basically as an air conditioning system. So even though this is exposed to direct sun in the summer, in the middle of the day when it's 100 degrees outside, it's actually cooler inside the greenhouse than it is outside, because it's pulling that air through the earth where it's cooled before it enters the greenhouse. This is the greenhouse that all of that work was based off of, an ecosystem greenhouse where the guy who built it came up with the concept of perpetual soils. So he started with one soil, and he's never amended it. He hasn't used any fertilizers, he hasn't used any chemicals, he hasn't brought in outside compost, and he's been cycling the nutrients throughout the system for over 35, almost 40 years now. When he started this experiment, he thought the soil would exhaust itself after a couple of years or after a decade, but he's found that the soil is actually getting more productive every year. And so it's really not the amount of minerals that you have available or the NPK, but it's how well is the biological system within your soil cycling those nutrients. And you can actually get a healthier soil every year without any inputs. And so this is a place, same kind of passive solar geothermal design. So in Montana, it's growing with no heat, no electricity, no fossil fuel. He's growing figs, he's growing persimmons, pineapple, guava, nectarines, peaches, all sorts of things that aren't possible in the outdoor environment, even in a feature like a crater garden that's going to maximize the microclimate. And just amazing what a rich biological soil, the flavor that produces, like nothing else. I was born in Georgia, but the best peach I've ever had was grown in Montana, a place where you can barely grow them And in most places, you can't grow them at all outside. So then I went on to a number of different projects. This is a natural swimming pool we did for a bed and breakfast. After doing some of these, I honestly don't know why anyone would ever choose to swim in a pool with all those harsh chemicals. This is using the biological means to clean and filter the water. It looks beautiful, the water smells nice, it feels great on your skin, you don't have that chlorine layer over you, and you can really feel good about the health and the quality of the water that you're swimming in. So I've done a few of these projects, smaller projects like that, but the projects that really get me excited are projects where I'm developing a whole farm ecosystem. And so this is one in Ecuador, for example, where we put in a pond, 2 paddies, about 1 kilometer of terraces. We established some more access ways. We tapped 3 springs for drinking water, another as an extra flow through for aquaculture. And this is an area where this was a cloud forest in the past, or close to a cloud forest ecosystem. They get 2 to 3 meters of rainfall, but they have a long dry season. And this was an area that was cleared and then grazed for a lot of years, not well grazed, poorly grazed even, I'd say. And so it struggled to hold water throughout the year, even as much water as they get. And so we looked at how can we create an area that's going to hold enough water for them to have throughout the year as part of an ecotourism lodge. And that was in addition to setting up some roads and access areas and drinking water and a lot of different farming infrastructure, terraces for cultivation of both perennials and annuals. And so the first thing to really look at when you're working with the earth is what is the earth you're working with? What are the layers? And so the first thing on every project I do is a test slice. And I don't just do one test slice, but I do a test slice in all of the areas I'm most interested to see till I start to really build a map of the soil, the subsoil in all the areas before I start working. In the past, I used to use the USGS information, but I find that it's done on such a scale that it's almost worthless. I barely even look at it anymore because what you find when you actually dig in those areas is very different from what the USGS soil records will tell you. And so for anyone working around water, working any kind of water retention, whether it's terraces, swales, ponds, dams, all of those kinds of things, anyone who's going to design that for you without doing test slices before, I would be very leery of, because the truth is you don't know until you dig, and if you don't have that information, you really can't plan a project accordingly. And so in this case, we had a deep clay layer that we could tie the pond into, the water feature, and this is cutting the key of the dam. So it's not the whole dam itself that needs to be watertight, but it's the core of the dam that needs to be enough clay, needs to be at the right moisture content, it needs to be compacted sufficiently, it needs to be connecting with that parent clay layer that you're tying it into. There's a lot of details there that really need to be done right, or you can get some catastrophic results. So this is part of the way after the first rain. You can see the pond filling up a bit. And we're always able to create really nice features as part of this too. This area has a big stone boulder sitting area in the shallows where it gets warmer and you can sit at different stones at different depths. That's what it looks like with the pond filled up. You can see a nice little thatch roof on the dock, and this gives you an idea of where the context of the project. To the terraces to the right, up there is the lodge site, which we also put in with access and all of those things. Above that is the springs that we terraced. And so in just a month with a small team, we were able to put in water retention, the 2 paddies in the pond, put in about 1 kilometer of terracing so that that rainwater is helping infiltrate into the ground and so that these areas were more navigable. We did a couple of different building sites, we did some roads, and then we created the drinking water for the site, gravity fed down to all of the building sites. And so with a good team and with a clear vision, you can really move quickly when it comes time to do the equipment work. This is just a little bit closer view of, you can see some recently cut in terraces above, the older terraces to the left, and the pond. This is shortly after construction, after some of the first rains that filled up the feature. Here's a time-lapse video of tapping one of the springs. This is a huge resource. I think people oftentimes don't understand that spring water is really the ideal drinking water. Well water has this, for one, it's kind of like sticking a needle into your arm and pulling out the blood when your skin is dehydrated. It might work for a little bit, but it's just pushing the cliff higher. And when you get to that issue, it's gonna be that much more severe, like we're seeing in California right now. But also, that's not really interacting with the living tissue of the earth. And so it's that spring water, first off, carried by the sun over the mountains into the ground, filtered, given the right minerals, cleaned. That's really our ideal drinking water. And so with these spring casings, we can have it all gravity fed. We can have it almost all natural materials except for the pipe that we're using. And then we're harvesting that water where it comes out of the ground in that layer and capping over that, so that you're preserving the quality of that water. And in spring tappings like this, an animal could literally go and die on top of this spring, and it wouldn't affect the quality of the water, because the rainwater isn't getting into the spring, just that spring has been very carefully put into a pipe so that that water maintains the highest quality. Now we go to another project in Tennessee. This is where a spring in the past had been tapped and just drained out of this area, because any of you who live in the southeast know that the rains used to be more and more regular, and now there's long periods of drought and heavy rains. And so a previous owner likely drained this spring so that they could get the tractor through. But what we did with this spring is made it into a water retention feature, and a really beautiful one that gives water for the agricultural uses around the farm. It also gives a nice area to dip off and swim in the hot summer, and it also provides a really nice aesthetic as well as a wildlife feature. And so again, we're doing the middle of the dam as that earthen, the right portion of the fine materials in the earth, compacted to the right amount at the right moisture content, tied into that original clay layer that's naturally in there, and building that up. In this case, we found a bunch of big rocks, and so we were able to get a little bit creative. Here you see a rock sticking out over a deep zone where a rock wall was built, and so that's a diving rock. And so you can see this rock that juts out there. That's one that you can actually dive off into pretty deep water. There's a nice dock, there's stairs to get in and out, making sure, my goal is really, when it comes down to it, to make sure that my clients end up enjoying their landscape better as an end result, whether that's eating more from it, whether it's interacting more from it, whether that's seeing the wildlife or swimming in the water. And so it's important to accommodate all of those uses as you go about creating these features that should last for thousands of years into the next ice age or catastrophic earthquake or hurricane, or they'll outlast any hurricane, just a level of flooding or volcanic eruption that can take anything out, of course. Here's another project in Oregon, another place that used to get a lot more consistent rains, but now has a lot of fire issues. When we were working there, the air quality was horrible. You could smell the fire in the air. But again, we're able to store that water, feed it into the landscape, and make something that's also a nice swimming feature as part of that. So here we had this dock with a ladder rung to get in and out, as well as stairs to get in and out of the water, making sure that people are really going to be able to enjoy what we create. Here's an old oak that had fallen on the property and caused some issues along this seasonal drainage. And so what we were able to do is set it up and mount it like a bridge, and then carve the top flat so that people can easily walk along the top of it. And that's part of a water retention area that we also did up there. And so this is just flying up on this. And so this is a really small feature. They don't always need to be big and grandiose, but this is something that, again, will help store those seasonal flushes of water. It's going to give water to the deer that come through here, to the birds, to all of the different wildlife, and it's helping feed that water into the ground. And so that's a really important thing that a lot of times when people talk about water storage or creating ponds or dams, they're not actually talking about feeding that water back into the earth. They're just talking about holding that water. But based on how you design and build the feature, it really determines the impact, the footprint that you're going to have. Here's another one in British Columbia. Same story. Everywhere I go, almost, it's the same story. There used to be more regular rains. There's long dry periods now where they have trouble with production. Even in climates that rain a lot, like this one on Salt Spring Island in British Columbia. This picture I show because it shows you real well that key because of the color difference in the material we were working with. Here the clay is really blue, and you can see that orangey material on each side. So the materials on the side aren't actually watertight, but because that wall of blue clay is built up and compacted, that's what holds all of the water in and also feeds it into the landscape around. One of the features that we sometimes do, particularly for people interested in aquaculture, is a monk. This is a swivel pipe that allows you to change the level of the water, allows you to drain the pond down if you want to. If you want to work on the water plants around the edge, harvesting those, or drain the areas down so that you can harvest crawfish on the banks or harvest the fish out of the deep zone where they're concentrated in the bottom. And so here's setting some of the dock post cedar, dead standing cedar that was harvested off of the property. And now I'll show you a short drone flyover of this project. Here you can see they already had one pond that actually has a leaky dam. Many times when people build ponds, they don't do that key right, tied into the natural layer, and that's how you get a leaky dam that, for one, won't hold water level like it should, but also is at risk of causing issues downstream. So here we're able to do a nice water feature down below that holds a lot more volume. It's going to be better from an aquaculture perspective because it's got more of that deep, cold, oxygen-rich water. It's got a nice dock. It's got nice stone stairs to get in and out of the water. But then it also will enable us to work on that other pond down the road because they use that for irrigation of their garden. So now they'll have the other one in place. But so I'm really looking to take this work all over the world because the more I travel, the more places I see that desperately need help and that desperately need these type of land use practices. And the reality of it is that there's a lot of places that are needier and therefore they're more motivated to change. And so those are the areas I really enjoy working, where I can work with people who are already living a lot closer to the landscape. They're motivated to do things a little bit differently if it improves their quality of life. And because they're already really connected with nature, most times I find that this stuff is really quite obvious to them in a way. They don't know necessarily the techniques and the strategies, but understanding the approach is something inherent because of how close they live to the landscape. So over the last 5 months, I've been working internationally for a lot of years now. I've worked on all of the continents except for Antarctica and Asia, where I'll work this summer. But this last 5 months, I was working in the Southern Hemisphere all over the place. So here's a project in New Zealand where we're at this beautiful mouth of an estuary, a small parcel, setting up a family homestead there, wonderful young family. And so there we were able to do some terraces, a very steep land, so we were able to get some access to different parts along the terraces. We were able to build up some home sites. Or building sites throughout the different areas, and then we're also able to tap this spring for drinking water because it was totally raw land. They didn't have anything on there, and we were also able to put in a small water retention feature as a small swimming hole and also to have a water feature to be able to irrigate out of. And I'll share with you too some of the stories that I gleaned along the way. One is here in New Zealand, where the local surfing town, Raglan, is an area where the bay used to be a really productive commercial fishery. People were saying you could go out there any time of day and there were fish just jumping all over the water. And it reached the point when dairy farms became really big and people cleared all the forests for dairy cows and they had them grazing right into the wetlands. It actually collapsed the fishery so much that there was no longer a commercial fishery. It was basically a total collapse of ecosystem function. And in just 10 years, working with these areas, working with the dairy farmers, turning more land back into forest and fencing the cattle out of the water areas, they've restored this area, not to its previous state, but to the point where there's again commercial fishing that happens where the ecosystem had just entirely collapsed to the point where it was no longer viable. So then I went on to a project in Australia. We did a workshop as part of the project. And you know, here I have this picture in here to remind me to talk about environmental footprint. You know, when I started this all out, I would have never imagined working with big machines and with diesel and grease and all of the chainsaws, all of the things that I'm doing now. And it made me think a lot of times when people talk about environmental footprint, they're talking about having the minimum environmental footprint, driving their car less, having a hybrid vehicle, having an energy efficient home, sustainable agriculture. I've really come to the point where I want to have the largest environmental footprint I can have, because I know that that human impact can be something that's very positive. And there's a lot of organizations, corporations, governments out there with a very negative and very huge environmental footprint. So I'm trying to have an equally large environmental footprint, but a positive one instead of a negative one. And so here we did a water retention feature again, a farmer without enough water. Water is really the ultimate capital that any farmer is farming, whether they know it or not. And the more water that you can hold on the land, the more you're going to be able to grow, the more viable of a farming operation you're going to have. So again, in Australia, it's very hot, so you can see we roughed in a dock to have this also be a nice swimming feature. A small shallow pond above to help feed the ecology below, a place for insects and small fish to grow, but then also a sediment trap, a place so that we make sure we're developing systems that aren't going to degrade really rapidly like a lot of poorly built ponds do, but rather ones with a long-term management strategy and one that is really designed to stay a nice, clear, clean water feature. And so here you see the water feature full. And one of the things I love, the little girl, Lacey, of this family just is amazed that she's never found the bottom of this pond, because the previous pond was built not great and then dug out deeper, but because they didn't understand the differences in the materials, they ended up making it leaky. And so she's always able to swim to the bottom of that pond, but this one she still hasn't been able to find the bottom of. And just hearing how much the kids enjoy the water is one of the things that makes me feel really good about the work that I do. So the next project was in Uruguay, other end of the world, but still southern hemisphere, a place very much like Colorado. They get a good bit of rain, but strong seasonality and really sandy soils here. So I apologize for the shakiness of this time lapse, but I chose too small of a tree for the camera. But again, we really had to hunt around this time to find the right material. You can't just build a pond anywhere you want. It's a mix of the catchment that you're going to have in an area, the type of material that you're going to have in an area, a lot of different factors. So it took us a while to find the right area, but we were able to make this really nice pond. It's fed by a low flow trickle stream, but that again is going to give them a swimming area to cool off, water for irrigation, and feed that water back into the earth, giving them a healthier ecosystem on their farm. Here you can see some more of the detailed steps to get in and out of the water, the spillway for the water coming down and in. And this is actually the start of a main vein on this property to distribute this water out and along a terrace and to another series of ponds down the road. And this shows you that spillway out, the wall of the dam. Also really keeping in mind the habitat that we're creating. So there's a lot of different things I'll do for that. Sometimes making coves in the water for fish to hide out, rock piles, fish pyramids for habitat, putting logs, roots, or stumps in the water, giving plenty of texture and area so that you can have a full ecosystem rather than just an open egg shape or circular pond where you can only grow fish of one size because they either eat or exhaust all the small fish. It's important to have all those nooks and crannies that life really needs to happen. So then I moved on to Bolivia. High elevation place with less moisture and really just some of the most severe erosion that I've ever seen. This is a landscape that at one point was treed, not all the way up, obviously at points this gets above tree line, but areas where the water has just cut huge scars into the land and people who really have a dire need for water. They have a real shortage of water. And these are the places where I just feel that there's a huge calling because with a little bit of different management strategies, they can totally change the landscape that they're working with. Again, here we found beautiful areas for water retention, other areas that wouldn't work. And it's really important to start to gain that familiarity, getting your hands dirty in the soil to understand how the different soil types will react and what the different solutions are in different places. Because I go plenty of places where you can't build a pond and you're instead focusing on storing the water in the earth in the best way possible. And my approach is if you need a liner or artificial materials for a pond, that's not really a natural place for it. And so you might need to reevaluate why you want that feature and if there's a more natural way to accomplish those same goals. Now this brings me to a project in Mexico. It looks lush and green and beautiful in this picture, but I assure you this was the start of the rainy season and just a few weeks before the month that we were doing this project. It's brown, crispy, dry, some of the most intense heat I've ever experienced. And this is a mesa up above a river where fires run through because they use a lot of slash and burn agriculture and they burn all the sugarcane fields before harvesting. So fire is a really big concern as well on this mesa. And here again, water is the fundamental feature. And so you can see these two different water features that we created. Ponds that are, this actually, when it rains so much that a seasonal arroyo, a little river, forms going down the middle of the property. And so with these water retention features, we're holding that and collecting it so that we can store that plentiful water when there's too much of it in the rainy season for the dry season, when there's just not enough of it. And so in about 3 weeks, we were able to do these two pretty sizable water retention features that are connected to each other and have started to outline the mainframe infrastructure for the farm. A lot of times, the work that we're actually doing is creating a pond or the terraces, but as part of each of these projects, we're also starting them out with a concept plan. So each one of these has a different plan developed to fit the goals and the abilities of the clients I'm working for. This one is planned to be a silvopasture farm, so bringing trees back on the landscape, using those for agroforestry, and then grazing those areas in between in a holistic animal management system. And so I've seen really so many of the same things working from the high up dry places like Bolivia and working right on the ocean and in climates all in between, continental climates, cold climates, tropical climates. Everywhere water is a growing concern and using water naturally for the productivity of the farm is one of the best leverage points you have on a property. And so I'm getting close to the end here. We just want to walk through the water cycle in a little bit more depth, but I also just really want to express a lot of gratitude for this man who totally changed my perspective. I went through school and all these different things, learning all the problems, but not coming up with any actionable solutions. And then I came across Sepp Holzer, who gave me so many tools in the tool belt of actionable solutions that make a positive impact, that are economically viable. And he's opened up so many doors to me, and I'll never be able to properly express my gratitude for having him as a mentor. And so again, just to walk through that water cycle one more time, and then we'll get to some questions. You have the mountains as this crown of the water cycle, holding that water, letting it slowly come out into the system. One of the really shocking things to me going through what's now termed a high alpine desert in Montana, driving through it, Sepp would say, "Oh, look at this. Isn't this horrible how desertified this landscape is?" And at that time, I thought that was the natural state of the land. The textbooks say that's the natural state of the land. But then he was sharing with me, he said, with this landscape, with these temperatures, with this precipitation, if there weren't mountains here, I could understand this being a desert. But because those mountains are concentrating, collecting, and storing that water, I know that these areas where that water moves through is a man-made desert. And sure enough, if you go back in the history books, if you go back into oral tradition with the indigenous people, all of these places that he was talking about were treed landscapes or savanna landscapes. And it's just incredible to be able to see that window into what was instead of just what is. So these mountains are a really important part of it. They're also, for me, a really important place to go and learn about water, how it's moving through the different types. You can see so many of the geological processes happening when on a mountain, and so I really appreciate my time on them. Then that's moving out into all the different foothills and ridges, and these are the veins of the earth feeding into the forests, which have so many different roles, really shading that soil, providing rich biomass. With their roots, they're actually feeding that water deep into deeper horizons. On Sepp's farms, if you dig down into the earth 4 or 5 meters deep, the soil is rich and full of life, with roots, with insects, with water. It's really incredible the types of soils you can get in natural systems. The trees also really feed the fungi, which are a neglected mega science. Here you see the little bits of white actually mineralizing the rock. In their metabolism, they're producing extracellular metabolites that are breaking off pieces of those minerals, making them available to the different plants. There you actually see those metabolites coming down as it's respiring. Fungi also actually create water. As the fungi are breaking down the lignin, they're breaking apart the carbon and the hydrogen, they're respiring oxygen from the atmosphere, and they're actually putting some of those hydrogen atoms together with some of the oxygen and creating water. I've heard as much as 40% the wet weight of a wood gets released in the form of water after a fungi has finished breaking it down. And so again, this is a feedback. They're creating these spongy habitats that help distribute moisture, help feed it into the ground. They're also creating moisture as they respire, and they're also providing a host defense. They're the immune system of a forest in a way. And then you get to the rivers, the flowing water, these really vital veins of earth. In this place in Mexico, there's a wonderful story I just love so much, where this river has been life to this village. It's a fishing village, and now it's a tourism village where they do rafting along this river, and the government wants to dam it up for a hydropower plant. So there's a very big difference between a hydropower dam, which is now controlling that water based off of electrical needs and doing all sorts of unnatural things with it that degrade the ecological system, versus decentralized water retention broken apart throughout the landscape. And so this village, because they're so dependent on the river, they, for 4 years running now, all the approvals are in place for the dam, the contractors come in and get started, and for 4 years running, they've prevented this dam from being built by chasing away all of the people with machetes. They have a 24-hour watch at the dam site where they're trying to build. Whenever machines show up or contractors show up, they call everyone in the town. Everyone gets out there with the machetes and protects their water. And that's a really beautiful thing to see, that kind of civil courage protecting that vital resource. And then you get to the churning water, the rivers, the waterfalls, the areas where that's really becoming oxygen rich. Bacteria are living in and around those rocks, filtering and cleaning the water. And it's really such a vital part, feeding into the mangroves and the swamps and the wetlands and the estuaries that are further filtering and cleaning that water. Here you see all those mangrove roots combing sediment out of it, combing nutrient that shouldn't be in it, helping. So many ecosystems are out there, always providing these services that are regulating the water cycles on the planet. And so from what I've seen, we have just huge opportunities from the top of the watershed down to the bottom of it. And it's incredible. I just am filled with such a sense of hope, traveling all over the planet, helping people who really, they see these problems and they want to be part of the change. They want to do what they can to create that change, and they just need a path forward. And I'm thankful for SEP for showing me that path, and thankful for other people for letting me share it with them. And so this is my business, Elemental Ecosystems. Would love to hear from you guys for any reason, and I'm happy to open it up to questions at this point, Raleigh.
Woohoo!
All right, good stuff. Don't forget to get your Elemental Ecosystems hat. It's the best hat, the coolest. Get that merch. Okay, awesome. Yeah, thanks, Zach. That was a really cool presentation. I like that.
I love how nonchalantly you just blow people's minds. You're like, and then this is something that blows your mind, and here's something else I did, and it's gonna blow your mind too.
Yeah, no, I think, Zach, what's so good about this is it's showing that you can improve on the natural landscape. That's just, a lot of people in conservation, they just think, oh, we should just ban all humans, ban people away, fence it off, and that's the end. Like, you're like, okay, I'm going to take the wisdom of indigenous people who have known something that Sepp might have known his whole life, and then do that same principles of rebuilding the ponds, bringing back the trees, like improving the way the nature functions there. And
yeah, that's something I really think about a lot. And I think especially, we're never going to be able to restore the water cycle the way it was. We've got all these big cities built up. We've got highways. People aren't going to lose all of that stuff. And so to rebalance our impact, we've got to take the places that we can work and push them even past what they were, so that they're stronger ecological function, more ecological function, to help balance out those areas that it's not going to be practical to rebuild and to rework.
Yep.
Yeah, that's right. 10 years ago, when you think about yourself 10 years ago, do you think you'd be a terraformer or?
Whew, definitely not a terraformer. I mean, I always wanted to work with nature. I always liked being outdoors more than in, and nature more than people. But I thought it might be as like an outdoor guide, or I certainly didn't ever imagine doing what I am now until I met Sepp and just saw this. He blew my mind and continues to blow my mind, and just opened up all these possibilities. And it just, the way that I like to say it is, there was this big brick wall barrier and he just charged right through it, and now I can just nonchalantly walk through it.
Yeah, man, that's awesome. I mean, like, from my experience of working with you, like getting to build even the natural swimming pool, that was the first project where I actually got to be there building, and it was such a good experience being out there, and everyone's just, they're building the hugelkultur beds, and you see the progress, and you see the pictures afterward, and you're just like, man, that was such a cool project to be a part of. And
there's something really fulfilling about just seeing your impact on landscape, seeing that we created that. And then one of the best things I think people can do is just plant a tree, and then just watch that tree grow, watch the birds that live in it, watch all the insects that it gives life to. That our actions have such a ripple effect, and it's really fulfilling when that ripple effect is a positive one instead of a negative one.
yeah, absolutely. All right, well, why don't we open up the questions now? First one's from Roberto. He's asking, great webinar, Zach, amazing projects. Here in Cyprus, we have water issues and the landscape can be quite challenging, lots of rock rather than dirt. What would a solution be to this type of landscape? Reforestation?
Yeah, Cyprus is a really interesting one, and there's two islands, not super close by, but Ascension and something else that I'm blanking on the other name, but basically one they reforested, and both of them were clear cut. One was reforested. This was around the time of Darwin. I think he actually worked in that project and really became healthy. And then the other they left goats on and is cactus and scrub. And so reforesting is, I would say, the most broad one that you can do. You can't really go wrong reforesting an area that was forested. But even in the worst places I go, the sandiest places, the rockiest places, water carries and moves sediment as it moves through landscape. And it's dropping the biggest particles first as it starts losing energy, and then it's dropping smaller sand and then silt and then clay. And so even in some of the worst types of material, there are oftentimes still places where the water's carried all the clay that you can do these type of water retention features. Because what I found more and more is it's not an either or, but the two feed themselves. The water retention feature feeds the forestry system, and the forestry system feeds the water retention feature. And so it's best to do the two right together. But it's hard to give place-based solutions without seeing it myself, because the practical thing that you do in one situation, it might be the exact wrong thing to do in a different type of situation.
I'm going to jump in on that. Is that okay?
Yeah, please do.
First off, I think, Roberto, you're already familiar with Nicolas Netien's place and webinar that we did with him. He's doing olive groves in Cyprus along the demilitarized zone. But I'm just going to share this picture if that's okay. I'm going to change the presenter. I'm making myself presenter, Zach.
Please do.
Go for it.
And let's just show my screen. Oh.
All right, here we go.
Does everybody see this photo? It's probably...
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so here this is a place where we've got around 90% runoff naturally, very rocky. And we had to put in physical structures to actually create places where silt would collect. And now when it does rain here, the only place we really get grasses growing is along these structures that we've put in. Because like Zach said, it catches the sediment, but the other thing is it catches any sort of annual grass seed that was higher up in the watershed. And then that seed collects, and then it gives us a place where we can either collect seed or where seed will be carried further down. But oftentimes in places where you're dealing with super sandy or super rocky, you can't necessarily dig physical structures to hold the water. You may have to build them on top of the ground rather than hollowing them out. And that's all I'm going to say about that. Now I'm done being the presenter.
And that brings up one of the really key things there that you touched on, Neil. If you can get that water away from the erosive phase into the phase of deposition,
yeah,
there's all sorts of good things that happen from that.
Yeah, exactly. All right, next question.
All right, next question is from Dustin, kind of a follow-up question to that. He's saying, how often do typical sediment traps need to be emptied, and what does one do with the dugout material? Do you need heavy equipment to clean them out?
So that really changes based on the site, based on how much water is moving through, based on what's above on the site. Sometimes it's a once every 10 or 20 years kind of thing, and another site might be once every year kind of thing. Usually I make them so that you don't need a machine to dig them out, unless if the person has some specific machine, which I might make it designed for that. And then again, based on the area that you're at, that's going to be different things. Usually that's really nice garden silty soil, so you can actually use it as a garden amendment. Sometimes it might be really sandy soil you might use for roads or paths. Based on how much water is moving and what it's carrying, that determines what you would want to use that sediment for.
All right, cool. Good question. Let's see, there was one bit earlier from Suzanne. Suzanne's asking, are you primarily using the ponds indirectly to recharge water levels in the soil and increasing moisture in surrounding areas, or to use directly as irrigation sources?
I would say both of those. A well-designed pond is always recharging the ground around. A lot of times you don't need irrigation. Other times you do need irrigation, and so you might be building a pond to be able to irrigate trees enough to get them going without that supplemental irrigation. But the systems that I do, one of my measures of success is this system going to continue to improve and increase in health without any human inputs? And so for that to be the case, it needs to be passively irrigated with natural function. There are situations so dire, though, that you do have to use a pump to help distribute that water to get things established.
All right, good stuff. So I had a question earlier from Jennifer. She's asking, have you done any work in northern Arizona where it's very arid and getting more so?
I haven't in northern Arizona. I've worked in some arid places. I've worked in the high mountain west, but higher than that in terms of latitude, colder. I would really welcome that because it's a place that needs it a lot, certainly. And having just been on a consultation in Southern California too, man, California is a place that needs it 20 years ago, really.
Yep. Raleigh, there's no sound.
Oh yeah, now there's sound. Okay,
There
cool.
you go.
Thanks for letting me know. All right, so this is a question from Rob Breeden. This is about life as a consultant. How do you find your clients? It's all caps. How do you find your clients, Zach?
It's a great question. They find me. I don't really do a lot of active marketing, or any, I should say. A lot of, word of mouth is a big thing. You do a project for one person who loves it, they tell all their neighbors about it, then their neighbors start wanting it. Every place that I go to do a project, there are other people that want consultations, that want a project down the road. So previous work feeds future work big time. SEP recommends me for some projects now, but I think also just a big way that people find me is from education. I'm really open about giving all of the information I have to offer out for free through things like this webinar and podcasts and things of that nature. And I think that really helps people find me as well.
Awesome. And videos too. You got some sweet videos.
Yep, videos as well, definitely. I find that with all of this stuff, the best way to get it in front of people is just teaching them about it, teaching people what's possible, how you do it, what the steps involved are, and the people who want to do that are going to find you and have you help them implement it if they don't feel comfortable doing it themselves.
Yeah, here's a follow-up question from Roberto. He's asking, thanks. Have you worked with governments, or how do funds come in?
So far, I've worked all with private land ownership. Governments, really, that's what I see as the next big step. But in the public sector, everything moves way too slow for me, to be honest. So I would really like to train other people that work in the public sector while I work in the private sector, building this base of projects, base of examples, so that that person who goes to the public sector has a huge amount of work to stand on to say, here's what it looked like here, here's what happened here, all of these different things. But that's too slow and too much paperwork for me right now.
Yeah, fair enough.
I'm knee deep in that paperwork right now.
Uh,
That's that's the slog I'm doing.
I
you
don't do
must,
good with paperwork.
I bet. It's crazy though. It's like how these projects you hear of like holistic management. Elaine was talking about these 100,000 hectare projects. Like they're out there, but it's always like a combination. It's hardly ever just one guy, one family has this land. Okay, question from Pascal. Hi, how'd you implement water retention landscapes in an area where rain is very prolific 9 months of the year and very dry for the remaining three?
That's really an ideal kind of scenario, because one of the things that people don't realize is you do a lot of the same things in an area that's too wet, for example. Maybe you have a wetland that it's too wet to do certain things with, but it's not wet enough to do other things with. And so you're actually concentrating the wet and concentrating the dry, directing each so that you get an amplification of each. So for example, in a wetland, you might take an area that's very hard to cultivate and turn it into an area with some forestry areas where they're now dry enough because you pulled that soil out and put it in other places to have trees with a nice root system. And then you have that wet area dug out as an aquaculture system, so you're concentrating both extremes. So with a 9-month wet season, depending on how much moisture you're receiving during those months, you might be more in that kind of setup where you're actually working with too much moisture most of the year. But the systems are basically built as a balancing shock absorber. So if you have too much, it's going to balance that out, direct it to the right places, and store it for the times that are too dry. And then once you get to a level that all of your water retention is full, it continues on downstream and feeds the neighbors, feeds the other areas. But a big thing is when you have these flooding events, if a flood is following a drought, these systems are going to be low, they're going to be drier, so they're going to charge up with that flood. And so you're going to get less flooding water moving downstream. And I think that hopefully that answers the question.
All right, I think that did it. Next question's from Dustin. Oh, no, this is from Hussam Hawa. He's asking, thank you, Zach. I've also been blessed in meeting Sepp Holzer. For less privilege in meeting Sepp, do you recommend any courses we can take to learn and apply to some of these techniques? Do you provide any?
Um,
Or can we help you build one?
I mean, I'm actually looking to do, I can't say too much here because it's a long way from being figured out, but I'm looking to do a slightly different system where instead of offering education, I basically train people and then provide them a business opportunity. And that's something that I can't tease too much because we're a ways down the road. I don't offer workshops or courses. I'll offer stuff that other people organize. But the best way to learn more, I think, is finding someone who does it and make yourself available to them and go and work on projects for free if you need to, or organize things for them to share their knowledge. My whole apprenticeship with SEP basically entailed of me organizing workshops for him to come and teach at until I proved myself useful enough that he invited me to come work on projects with him where I still wasn't getting paid, but I was learning a tremendous amount, picking up all the things that I needed to know, to now he invites me on a project and the client's paying me, he recommends me for other projects. So, and it's not just him. There's thousands of these elders out there that might be a little bit estranged from society, but they're doing really cool things. And if you can get past their personality quirks or things like that that may be turning other people off of them, you can learn so much, and then you're going to be ready to apply that knowledge versus going to a classroom, learning a whole bunch of stuff, and then really not ending up ahead because you can't go make it happen for someone else. You just learned about it in a classroom. You have to be there while it's happening, and then you can start to put all the pieces of the puzzle together.
Yeah, that's one thing I was talking about Elaine, and they're training guys that like in soil restoration who didn't go to college, they're like 18 years old right out of high school, and by practical training, they're getting the same experience as like a PhD level student and getting professional like consultation jobs from like at like when they're in their early 20s. Like that's just crazy because they got so much practical training and apprenticeships.
The practical training is huge. If you then have a marketable skill, you have a service to offer people. If you just know about it, you still don't really have anything to offer.
Yeah. There are some things like some classes have been really cool, like you teach and you're like, oh, you take a class and if you can implement the information right there, then, I think that's hugely useful. All right, so this question from Dustin, kind of a follow-up to that. He's asking, thanks for answering my first question. One more, if you don't mind. Do you see a lot of demand for this kind of water restoration work, enough for it to work economically to expand with more trained workers?
Yeah, absolutely. I see more, there's currently more demand than I can service, even though I do know marketing and oftentimes don't respond to people for 2 weeks or a month at a time because I'm off the grid in Mexico working and I have more projects than I can service and every day people asking me to do more. And then any place that I go and do a project and give a presentation, there's 4 more people in the room that want to do that. So I see huge opportunity there for growth. I think more than I even can understand. And that's why I'm looking to actually train up people within their bioregion. So instead of me going to Mexico every year to do a project, train a Mexican that's in that town that knows their language, that knows the culture to actually be doing that work. Because I think in every one of these places I go, there could be a whole business that operated just in that one location.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'll comment on that one too, just a little bit. I don't consult the same way Zach does. I'm on one project that I've been on for the last 8 years or so. But every time I go out and speak, there's always offers. I think the demand for this kind of work is so massive because more people are becoming aware of the need to do this kind of thing, and the fragile points of the system are becoming a little bit more frayed or a little bit more visual. And so I think, and then there's just a whole lot of zeitgeist right now behind, for instance, the term regenerative agriculture used to be like something 20 of us knew, like in 2005, that's the first time I heard that. And now they're like having entire conferences about regenerative education and regenerative agriculture and regenerative, like it's this giant buzzword now. And it's not just in the private sector. In the public sector, there's a lot of this work becoming available, and it's not just piecemeal. It's also institutions and people like investors and venture capitalists who are looking for ways to bring this into place. So I think the market's expanding very quickly.
I think in my experience too, the market, the upper end of the market just continues to develop. As things become more clear and graphic, the people with a lot of resource really want to move into this. They're like, okay, let's do this now. People are, major organizations are buying water rights or land with a lot of water. All the wealthiest people are starting to grab the resources that they're seeing as valuable, and water is the most fundamental one. And just to speak a little bit more to that, I mean, just yesterday I was training up 2 new guys, so I'm kind of always in a process of adding new guys, but a big thing is it has to be the right people because I'll say I have particularly poor experience with the permaculture enthusiast because they come out and they don't really know how to work. Give me, any ethnicity of the different places that I've gone. Give me a daily laborer of one of those type of people over the permaculture apprentice because most people don't know how to work hard anymore. And I think that's a big piece. There's tons of work for the people that still know how to work hard.
Yeah, fair enough. This question about urban space from James. He's asking, in densely populated areas, for instance, the New York, New Jersey metro, do you see a lot of these techniques as doable, especially in regard to working around existing underground infrastructure and educating local governments as to what you're creating?
Yeah, so I look at that a lot when I'm in cities. And I think you could, some of it can be managed at the point of contact, so the point at which the rain is hitting, whatever it is, whether that's vertical gardens along balconies that are taking the compost from in the house and using the water that's falling on the building to passively irrigate all of that, or whether it's on a larger scale and where all of that water is running to, a wetland is created or some type of water feature is created to help store. So I look at, in the future, we may look at it as a necessity in building a home to build a pond to offset that impact. You're capping this much earth with solid surface, so you need to put that much water back into the earth. And we could do the same thing on a city scale. It would be in the areas around the cities, but it would also create nice natural areas, parks for people to go. One of the interesting things along those lines would be to look at Denmark's floodable parks, where they have these parks that when it rains, it's a water feature. It fills up with water, it infiltrates into the ground, and then it's a park again in the dry times.
Nice. There's a lot of folks asking questions about pollution. So this is for example, Josie's asking, there's large areas of Colorado that have severely challenged water-wise as a result of fracking. Can you think of ways to your approach that could help heal this sort of damage to aquifers and ecosystems?
And really, I think the only way to clean up all those things is with the ecosystems. Eventually, the ecology will balance, nature will take care of all these different pollutants. Whether we're around to see it is another question. But wetlands are a great filter. There's a lot of fungi that can bioaccumulate different toxins. But what people who are working in that field are finding is that full ecosystems do the best job. So it's not just the fungi, it's not just the bacteria, it's actually when they're all working together in an ecosystem that you get the most cleaning. So step number one, stop polluting, but probably the actual step number one is starting to regenerate some of these polluted areas and starting to trial more biological fixes, more ecological fixes to these challenges. Because we have to start to really start finding out the results.
Fair enough.
We're at 90 minutes. Should we cut the recording and go to the informal super secret session for only people who attend live?
Where I can really speak my mind.
There we go. How
That's
about let's do that. So why don't we cut it? There's still a few other questions. A lot of people are like, I want to work with you, Zach. How do I work with you? So if someone wants to, potentially they want to train on a project or they want to hire you for their project, what's the best way they can get a hold of you?
Contacting me through the website is the best way for all of that. You'll see it's broken out into people who want to do projects, people who want to do education or other things. Yeah, basically I have certain projects that I can bring volunteers on, and it's really not fleshed out enough to share the whole thing, but I'm working on a concept for expanding all of this, for training more people, to get more people working within the organization and to be able to take on more projects. So we're still trialing a lot of these things out, but for people who are interested, I would say get in touch with me and be patient if it takes a week or two, because I'm pretty much always on an earthworks project that is sun up to sundown, and then I have that little bit of time the rest of the day to do all of my emails and any personal things I might actually want to do. But I'm hoping to actually get a place down the road where I'll be able to have volunteers come more steadily to keep trialing out different people. Because I would love to have a much bigger crew than I do now, but I have to take my time and just add the right people to the equation at this current moment in time.
Yeah, you got it. Gotta have the right folks. And so thanks everybody we're gonna cut the recording, but for those who are new to this, check out more webinars like this at sustainabledesignmasterclass.com. We've got almost 60 webinars we've done so far, all on awesome regenerative system designers like Zach, ecosystem restoration folks, entrepreneurs, and yeah, it's keep getting new ideas from it and reach out and work with folks that you want to work with, like Zach, like like Elaine, because they're out there and they're looking for people. They're looking to train the next generation of competent ecosystem restoration folks. So thanks everybody. Let's cut the recording and we'll get to the secret session.